We all come from very different starting points in our fitness journey, and my fitness journey looks very different to most people. So in 2016, I underwent a major surgery to remove some cancer, and that experience completely changed the way I think about my body and it changed the way I train now. So, what I need to do is I need to first take you back to 2016 when I got the diagnosis. So, at the time, I was actually working at a fast food joint, and I remember I was working incredible long hours. And I don't know if you've ever worked in fast food, you probably understand that you're constantly on your feet, and the pace, especially, is constant on the go. Um, and I vividly remember there was some excruciating pain, and it was the end of the shift. I went home and I thought, this just does not feel right. So I took myself to the hospital, and I thought it was just like a quick little checkup. Everything was going to be okay. I was going to go home that evening. But next thing I knew, they were asking me to stay over the weekend. And then following that, they suggested I actually had to go to um, a more specialized hospital that actually dealt with this kind of stuff. So I was lost at the time. I was thinking, what on earth is going on? In my mind, I was still thinking, oh, this is just a normal routine thing they do. Not knowing actually that the specialized hospital was because they just didn't have the facilities to look at what they thought at the time, um, what it was. So, anyways, just fast forward. I got the next working day, and that's when they kind of ran some more testing, and then they discovered that actually I had a really rare form of cancer. It's a form of bowel cancer, but it's not found in the bowel, which is why they were a little bit stumped by it. And I remember them telling me there was only, I could be wrong about the stats now because it was so far ago, but if I remember correctly, I was like one out of, I think, 90 or 60 people diagnosed since 1990. And that's worldwide, that stat. So I was like shocked. I was like, how could this be cancer? Because my mind, I thought cancer was something that was really going to struck you. You would know if it was, but yeah, I honestly I didn't realize at the time that I was actually going through cancer. And alhamdulillah, though, the type of cancer it was a very, very slow growing cancer. And I guess that analogy about when you throw a frog into, a boiling pot, the frog will want to jump out. But if you slowly turn up the heat, the frog will actually stay and eventually will die because it doesn't realize the temperatures keep going up. So in essence, I guess I just didn't pay attention to the warning signs because they were happening so slow. And eventually, once I did get checked, they realized that it was a rare form of cancer. So, anyways, just fast forward this a little bit. What ended up happening was I then had to undergo a major surgery because the cancer had spread and it attached itself close to one of the arteries or vein. I can't remember which one it is, but it's the one's connected near the heart. So there's no valve actually stopping blood flow in that part of. I think it's an artery. So there's no valve to stop blood flow. And as a result of that, they actually had to do open chest surgery to remove the cancer from there and a whole bunch of other areas in that it had spread around that space. So it was a really decent chunk of surgery that needed to be done. It was originally scheduled for an 8-hour surgery. I remember going in there and it was completely they needed to actually bring in that specialist to finish the surgery because it was around the heart. Because he was only on standby. He wasn't actually anticipating it to be around the heart. They discovered that once they'd opened me, that it was actually on that artery. So they're like, oh, okay, they need to actually get the specialist in and then do it. So from an 8-hour surgery, it blew out to 16 hours, and my recovery was in ICU. And if anyone has ever gone through that kind of surgery, open chest surgery, the recovery is what smacks you. Because I walked in, I felt fine in the sense, like I was able to move around freely. I didn't feel like I was restricted in my movements. I just had this pain, but it was like pain I'd gotten so used to that I was just moving around with it, kind of masking the pain for the most part. People didn't actually realize I was in that pain until um, the hospital actually realized I had cancer. And then I kind of understood that whole time I thought was normal pain, just, I don't know, like growing pains, was actually more cancer related. So anyways, that recovery part is what really struck me. So I went from completely being able to move, suddenly now I'm in the hospital. ICU, and immediately they want me to get up and start moving and do a short walk and things like that, because in that, I remember actually the nurse saying that movement is medicine in that instance. Like, the more you move, the better your recovery will be. But unless you actually have to go through something like that, you don't realize how painful moving like that is. And I had 44 staples. They can't stitch an open chest surgery like that. They had to use staples to kind of keep, basically, I had it from up here near the sternum all the way down past the belly button, and that was all open. So 44 staples to kind of keep that sealed. And then they tell you to get up and move. It was excruciating, and the amount of pain meds I was on, it was unbelievable. But anyways, very, very intense recovery that I was then suddenly having to face. Now, going through something like that really shifted the way I thought about moving. So that was in 2016. I was diagnosed and I went through the surgery, and now in the recovery phase at mid 2016. And I spent like I think 6 weeks just trying to get the basics right. Then the basics is literally getting up to move, take yourself to the bathroom, make yourself a small little meal, nothing fancy in the kitchen, like something as little as a sandwich or things like that. And it was really, really, really difficult. Like, I could not move as freely as I wanted to, and I hated that feeling. There was a constant need to be dependent on others, and I was 23 at the time going through this, and I was like, I should be able to move around and move freely. I had this conception in my mind that type of feeling only happens when you get older, and that's just part of being part of aging, which I don't agree with now, but at the time I did start thinking that way. So the recovery was getting quite exhausting for me. I remember it was just constantly trying to get one step ahead each day, and those small movements, moving from the couch to the kitchen and things like that. It was just each day I was trying to build that more and more, and eventually make it to the car. Somebody drive, we'll go do a little outing in the car, get some scenery in, because you just get bored of seeing four walls. Um, and it was also during the time I had my exams. So I was at uni at the time, and I was during exam period, and I was like, I don't want to defer too many exams, because then I just have to pick it up later. But there were some exams I knew I could finish off, so I even actually was working myself through that movement to try to ensure I could make it just enough to at least sit one of the exams. And alhamdulillah, I did actually manage to do that. But it was a constant battle to try to really push my body from that instance where I could barely move because of the 44 staples and the whole surgery that just in a day incapacitated me. So that really, really shifted the way I thought about my body. And growing up, I was into sports, but not actually in the sense I was constantly playing sport. I just liked the idea of playing and socializing with sport, just because I didn't get a lot of time to get to do that because I live so far away from school. So it was just a constant traveling issue for me. But I did eventually, post-surgery, really wanted to get my body back to a place where I was able to move and enjoy those things. And from 2016 to 2020, during that period of time, I was just focusing on relearning my body, moving it, not in any crazy way. It was more so just to move it in the most natural way that we all do day to day, that we take for granted actually. So I was just getting back on track with that and really trying to get some of that basic movement back, which I did eventually, alhamdulillah. But I think over time, once I got closer to 2019, that's when the lockdown started, I think I started to take for granted that movement again because I wasn't able to move out and about. I was more so stuck indoors, and I could feel it. It was starting to put more pressure on me in terms of the way I was able to move. And one key thing about the surgery that I had was because there was no valve in that artery, and they had to put an artificial graft in. That meant that my body was actually more susceptible to blood clots. Now, a blood clot in the artery is quite risky because there's no valve to prevent that blood clot from traveling straight to the heart, the brain, or the lungs. So there was actually quite a bit of a risk in that. So the doctors tried to keep me on blood thinners, and that itself was a whole terrible experience because that actually limited my movement because I wasn't able to do anything impact sports or weightlifting and things like that because the moment I bumped into something, it just like bruise like no tomorrow, and it just wasn't sustainable. I thought to myself, like, I'm in my 20s and I'm bruising like I'm in my 60s. It just I didn't like that. So the doctors had actually explained that the blood thinners was more a precautionary measure because they weren't sure how my body would respond. And they were only 50-50 about whether I should take the blood thinners or not. So I took this part in my own hands. I wouldn't recommend anyone go against medical advice, but I think I was in a desperate situation where I actually wanted to see some meaningful aspect to my life, and constantly bruising just wasn't it for me. So I actually went off that medication, but I told myself in that moment that in order for me to try to sustain a healthy lifestyle and have that freedom to move, I need to make sure I'm doing that more actively myself and not just sitting at home and doing those smaller movements, but being more active in my day-to-day life. So that's really where this really shifted my mindset about the way I look at fitness, was because I needed to make sure I was able to do it in a way that actually sustained life. So in my instance, it actually is a matter of life and death. But I think it took that reality check for me to actually go through that. But in essence, I think we're all kind of living that way, because if we don't start taking that action early on and looking after our health, it does creep up to you much later down the track. Mine is just has a more immediate effect versus waiting to become, you know, waiting to build up that fat and that visceral fat and become obese and all those other health issues that take a lot longer to build up and get to that crisis point, I guess. My crisis point is a lot shorter if I don't stay on top of my health and fitness. So that's why I really started to change the way I look at fitness, and I actually found I started to fall in love with how I was training, and in the process, and in that moment, I realized that fitness was far greater than just, I never trained to look a certain way. For me, it's always been about moving, being free in your own body to move the way you want to move and without that restriction. And I always think back to the time I had that surgery where I couldn't move and I was constantly dependent on others. I felt like I almost got a flash into what the 60s, 70s could be like if I didn't look after my health here and now. And it was a big wake-up call that I think not many people experience. And alhamdulillah, for myself, I was able to experience that. But it was a really pivotal moment where I had to make sure I was looking after my health so that I can be more free in my movements in my younger years. And that actually then goes to when I get older as well, because if I look after it now, then I'm going to experience the benefits when I get older. So that's really what shaped my whole fitness journey. And then we moved past 2020, when I started really getting more active and looking after my health and fitness. I started falling in love with calisthenics at that point, and I still do. But the aspect of it that I really enjoyed was before this, right, when I was talking about my surgery, I couldn't move. Post 2020, I started to move and get some of that basic movement in my body again, and then started training calisthenics, and now I've unlocked movement I've never been able to do in my entire life. And I thought cancer was going to be the point that was going to set me back, and I'd never get past the physicality of what I was prior to 2016. But alhamdulillah, through perseverance in that training, I'm actually now at a point I can move better, I'm stronger than what I had been in my 20s, and I'm in my 30s now. So that was a huge wake-up call for me to understand, is that fitness actually is an enabling factor for anyone in their life when you take it seriously and be consistent and disciplined about it, because it will provide you more freedom because you're not reliant and dependent on others to do the most basics of things. Now, 2020 to 2023, that was that transition phase I was talking about where I was training a lot more and got into calisthenics. And then come 2024, sorry, let me rewind just slightly a bit. In 2023, that was actually a point I was undergoing, because of the cancer. If I wanted kids, I actually have to undergo IVF. So we did IVF in 2023, and that itself is a massive journey. And for anyone that hasn't been through it, IVF is a very exhausting experience, and I think far more exhausting on your partner, on your spouse, your wife. It can bring up a whole bunch of it. But anyways, what I'm trying to get at is that moment in 2023 where I was going through IVF was a moment I really thought about what it means to become a dad. And throughout all this time, the cancer had basically made me think about movement is medicine. Remember that nurse from day one after I went into ICU? So day one from ICU, I remember that nurse when she was saying movement is medicine. And that has rung through from then all the way up until now. Because when I was going through IVF, it actually helped the training to relieve some of the stresses. But I always thought to myself is that this training isn't never just going to be about, oh, how can I get fit and look fit and whatnot. It was always about how do I move better and what benefits am I gaining out of this movement. And the key thing is, if you can move better as a dad, you actually have more ability to get on the floor with your kids, because for the most part of your children's life, they spend a lot of the time on the floor. Those first 5 years, they're practically like right down there. They're experiencing the world, and in that lower sense there. So your ability to get on the floor and engage in their world means you have a better chance of having that bond with them and being more present in that moment of their lives. You can join their games. I'm a girl dad. I never thought I'd be on the floor sipping fake tea, but here we are. But that freedom came from the fact that I was able to move. And that's really what shapes the way I think about fitness now. Is I want to help other people, other dads especially, to ensure they have that ability to move around and get on the ground with their kids, because that limiting factor I experienced in 2016 and that inability to move at the greater end of that scale, where I was so dependent on others, I don't want to see that for other dads where they struggle to get in those basic movements with their kids, where they really want to engage with them, but they might be suffering some back pain, long hours at work, and struggling to find the time to get some of that training in. It doesn't need to be so complex. It can be as simple as a home workout, and that can just kickstart things. But it's the whole thing about reframing about how we think about training, so that it's not about what it was, I think, 10, 20 years ago, where it's about getting jacked and being a bodybuilder. I think we are at a point now where more of us want to be fitter for a purpose, not to go on stage and be a bodybuilder. If you're somebody that's into that, then by all means, go for it. But most people are just trying to get by day to day, and basic fitness is needed so that they can actually be more present and meaningful in their lives. And there's plenty of research out there about the benefits of fitness, but I think it's really important just to remind yourself as to why fitness is important to you. And that's the reason why it's important to me and why I want to help other people, especially dads, along their journey to get their health to a point where they actually feel more present and have those interactions with their kids in a more meaningful way.